Sandwiched between two famous kings, his father John and his son Edward, he is the forgotten ruler of the 13th century. His reign was long and not beaten until George III. So, follow me as we explore the tumultuous reign of Henry III. Let's get stuck in. Anno 1217. Henry III is only around 10 years old. Already he's suffered the loss of his father, abandoned by his mother, then taken away from home, brought up by Peter de Roche, and then being the centre of a civil war won by a man old enough to remember the last one, more than 60 years ago. At least Louis, the Dauphin of France, has left England's shores in September, although some rebel tensions still remained. Minor squabbles, thankfully, and nothing that could reignite the war. A tournament in Blyth was cancelled in October, but only because it sparked off quarrels with the Scots. Then there was a Fifth Crusade, which was underway. One of the magnates who took the cross was the Earl of Chester, Ranulph de Blondeville. Alongside him were his old enemies, Ced de Quincey and Robert Fitzwalter. The three men putting aside their differences and heading for Genoa with quite a host. Never a dull moment in the kingdom. In November, the Magna Carta was reinforced. It would go through several iterations during its lifetime, hence when someone quotes the Magna Carta, ask for which version, the 1215, 16, 17, or the 1225? Which one? It would also pave the way for other charters like the Provisions of Oxford, which will occur in 1258, but currently we're in 1217, and this rendition of Magna Carta has several new clauses added on top of the current 40, including forest laws. People's concerns over forest laws were valid, as John abused disafforestation laws. Remember, disafforested, not deforested. No one is cutting down swathes of trees. It's basically illegal forest rights. It's forest law. The forests belonged to the king, and selling them off was a quick cash grab. John disafforested Cornwall for 2,200 marks, and Devon for 5,000. Unscrupulous, not good politics. The barons wanted the forests to be returned to how they were under Henry II, before Richard and John buggered things up. In fact, a separate charter of the forest would be issued. Around a third of England was currently under forest laws, wild lands used for hunting. A dangerous pastime, and Henry was no fan of it. He much preferred reading, or admiring architecture. He loved religion. Despite his military training, he wasn't fond of tournaments. Give him a game of chess any day. He preferred the old Saxon martyrs than tales of King Arthur. Edward the Confessor was his idol. Henry, under the guidance of the Marshal, wrote a letter to Pope Honorius III. A king so pious, imagine how he must have felt. This is like a preteen writing a letter to Taylor Swift, knowing she'll not only read it, but reply. Henry offered his support to the papacy, but wanted to be exempt from paying Louis the 1,000 marks a year, which was a part of some peace treaty. He also added a sweetener, praising Guala Bicchieri for his admirable service to the kingdom. On November the 12th, the Exchequer reopened, and people tried to make sense of the previous 2 years of accounts. The kingdom was seriously short of funds, as was the king. In fact, at Christmas, Henry spent the festive period at Northampton with Fawkes de Brou, much to the expense of the mercenary captain. He was used to receiving money from the king, not forking it out. And in January 1218, Peace was once again confirmed between Henry and Louis. There was also peace with Scotland, and a Scottish contingent led by Alexander II stayed at Northampton. The Welsh didn't seem to get the memo, and skirmishes broke out all over the region. Morgan of Caerleon was on the rampage, as was Llewellyn the Great. Many castles were lost, including 2 royal castles, Cardigan and Carmarthen. The elder Marshal sent forces to deal with this threat, while diplomatic channels were opened. Llewellyn and Morgan were given word that none of their territory was in jeopardy, and the chaos ended. There'd be no challenge on the Welsh provinces. You see, the Welsh princes had previously been excommunicated by Gualabicieri for siding with the French Dauphin, and they wanted it lifted. So at Worcester in March, Llewellyn began talks with the Marshal and Cardinal Guala, talks that resulted in the excommunication being lifted, but at a heavy price. Henry was to be made Overlord of Wales, and Llewellyn paid homage to Henry, and that was that. At last, the chaos that had racked the kingdom for the past 3 years was over. A terrible outbreak of peace had broken out all over the land. Oh, the horror. It wasn't without problems, though, as there was pushback to the regency, asserting royal authority over the kingdom. Of course, a stand had to be made, and the elder Marshal decided to make the castle of Newark that stand. Oh, quick thing, I'll refer to the Marshal, William Marshal, as the elder Marshal from now on. Why? Because he also had a son called William Marshal, a son that spent many years as a hostage to King John. Now he's in his 20s. He's a formidable knight and spent the Barons' War fighting on the rebel side. He is the younger Marshal, and his famous father, the elder Marshal, the Marshal being a title, as well as a name. One day, this title will evolve into the Earl Marshal that still exists today. But there's nuances to that, and more on that later. We've still got to deal with the situation at Newark. The castle belonged to the Bishop of Lincoln. Unfortunately, it had been occupied and controlled by a foreigner named Robert de Gourgy. He had been given it by King John, and had simply refused to hand the castle over. So in July, the Marshal, with the young king beside him, laid siege to Newark Castle. The siege lasted just 8 days, and ended peacefully with Robert de Gourgy walking out of the castle in surrender. The castle was then successfully restored to the Bishop of Lincoln. Many nobles were squirreling away funds for this Fifth Crusade, and they had no intention of giving the king a penny of it. A king who was increasingly present in the important meetings. He was already showing he was keen on learning how the courts worked, and it was declared that the Charter of Liberties would have to be reissued once the king reached his majority to make it fair. It's all going well for Henry. As for the Crusade, at some point news must have arrived in Christian lands that the Ayyubid Sultan, Al-Adil, aka Safaddin, the brother of Saladin, had passed away. He was an old man, aged 73, and had been trying to avoid another crusade all through his reign. Safaddin ruled the Egyptian part of the empire, as well as Damascus. He had very good relations with the Crusaders. Unfortunately, the Crusaders understood that in order to win Jerusalem back, they had to take Egypt, and the city of Demetia needed to fall. Then Christian ships arrived in Outremer, with troops pouring into the city of Acre and reinforcing it, while Demetia was subjected to a siege of biblical proportions. At least 80 ships packed with crusaders, ranging from the famous Knights Templar to the Knights Teuton and Hospitaller, plus many, many machines of war. One tower was all that stood as the first line of defence for this vast army, the Burj al-Silsila, or the Chain Tower. So far, the Islamic forces, led by the new Sultan, Al-Khamil, were proving highly effective in the defence of the city. Huge iron chains had been dragged across the port, anchored at this tower, blocking the crusading ships. The siege of the tower dragged on. The chronicler Roger of Wendover mentions a lunar eclipse, so we can only imagine what an impact this had on the superstitious armies who fought. Now, obviously the learned ones, the scholars, familiar with astrology, knew exactly what was going on, but the average soldier fighting on the ground, not so much. However, the Crusaders were led by Simon, the Count of Saarbrücken, and he'd been developing new technologies in naval warfare. He had constructed a colossal siege engine, this tower, in the form of two ships bound together with animal skins and rigging. This took the fight to the wall. Another machine was a wooden fortress atop a ship, used as a floating tower to throw projectiles such as stones and javelins. And there was nothing the garrison could do. The tower fell, allowing the Crusaders to create a beachhead, besieging the city in general. The crusade was going very well. Sadly, the former rebel, Ser de Quincy, the Earl of Winchester, who, as I explained earlier, had taken up the cross and joined the crusade along with Fitzwalter and de Blondeville. Now, de Quincy, he was part of the forces that were besieging the city of Demetia. Alas, he falls to illness and dies soon after. His body was buried in Acre, while his heart was eventually brought back to be buried in Loughborough, where he held his castle. So, returning our gaze back to the Kingdom of England, on the 12th of September 1218, Pope Honorius III recalled Cardinal Guala Bicchieri. His time as legate to England was up. He was no longer needed in that role, so Guala leaves the kingdom, heading back to Rome with a pack saddle laden with gold and silver, at least according to Wendover, and all his duties were to be transferred to the other, less mentioned legate, Pandolf Vraccio. Pandolf had been here since 1213. He was legate under King John and was the Bishop of Norwich. He was the one that absolved John's excommunication issues and ended the long religious interdict. He famously feuded with Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, which resulted in Langton being suspended in Rome during the war. Since then, he'd been helping young Henry repair Worcester Cathedral. And it wasn't like Guala was unwilling to step down. He longed to return to Italy, his home. Worn out by the Barons' War and overseeing a child king, finally he could put all this behind him. His final act as legate was to send a letter to the Marshal. Apparently Louis of France was supposed to release the hostages from the Cinque Ports. Then it passed to Pandolf. The Pope, meanwhile, wanted confirmation that the peace between Scotland and England was to be confirmed or annulled, and the peace was confirmed. Politically, it wasn't all easy. There are still some tensions in the kingdom. People just didn't feel threatened by an 11-year-old boy as king. no matter who he had working for him. Sure, he was now attending meetings and sieges, when it was deemed there'd be no danger, but he was still largely shielded from the political arena. So, in November, the king was given a royal seal, made from silver. It depicted on one side an adult king sitting on the throne, and on the other side depicted him as a knight on horseback. The seal was then put under protection of the Bishop of Chichester, Ralph Neville, protégé of Peter de Roche. And the first document the seal was pressed on was to confirm that none of Henry's charters would come into effect until he reached his majority. That is, became old enough to rule as a man, not a child. But Henry was not a rich king. A judicial court was launched at the end of the year, hearing criminal trials, civil pleas, and levying fines. It managed to raise a whopping great £1,000, not too shabby for the 13th century. Some of the verdicts were controversial, with Fawkes de Brute getting in the way for a number of them, but even he was brought to rank, and eventually obeyed the law. Henry was in Winchester for Christmas, with Peter de Roche along with his siblings, Richard, Joan, Isabella and Eleanor, and the next year, 1219, would change everything. Early on, the elderly William Marshal fell ill. It was soon clear that he couldn't continue his busy schedule as regent, and was taken by boat to his manor at Caversham. There he would rest and recover. Unfortunately, his health only worsened. On the 12th of April, a council was held with the king present. Though only a few magnates could make it, a good chunk of the nobility was still on the crusade, including Ranulph de Blondeville and Robert Fitzwalter. Nonetheless, the council continued. The Marshal's health was bad, and the venerable knight made preparations for the future of the kingdom. He willingly relinquished his regency. He wished for the barons to agree as successor as regent. They wanted to pass it to Ranulph de Blondeville, but he was away on crusade. No one else wanted the position. Besides Peter de Roche, he had a better idea. He was already looking after the king, he was already practically regent, he'd take the job. The arrogance annoyed the Marshal. Peter as regent? This was never going to happen. The fighting bishop was a divisive figure who understood war and strategy more than a lord's scripture. He knew the wrong taverns, too many bawdy songs. It was bad enough him being tutor to the king, but regent? Plus, Peter de Roche was politically ambitious and a plotter. So the Marshal declared the regency would end with him. The Marshal never intended that the 11-year-old Henry should govern himself. He'd still have his advisers, and it fell to Pandulf, another controversial figure, to oversee the kingdom during the king's minority. Thus, the regency ended. And on the 14th of May, 1219, after receiving the sacrament of anointing the sick, aka the last rites, the Marshal passed away peacefully, and a legend left this world. The likes that would never be seen again. In his long lifetime, he had served under 4 kings, and lived under 5, though if you add Henry the Young King to the mix, that's another under his belt. He was interred in London at the Church of the Knights Templar, buried in the habit of these warrior priests, and he was widely mourned over all of Christendom. An icon of chivalry. The title Marshal passed to his son, also named William, the younger Marshal. Although some said an old curse had been placed on the elder Marshal, in years gone by he had fought in Ireland during a civil war. He had taken castles belonging to the Bishop of Ferns. Legend had it that the bishop placed a bitter curse on the Marshal's dynasty in revenge. There had been no heirs, and the lands divided. Clearly fictional, and written a lot later with hindsight, but most probably written to explain the tragedy which happens next, as, indeed, none of the Marshal's male children would have heirs, and each of the sons would die, and the title passing from one to the other like the monkey's paw. A curse. So the lands were divided between the husbands of his 5 daughters, and the title Marshal ends up in the hands of Norfolk, where it technically remains to this day. Yes, there's a long break in the usual shenanigans, but that's another tale for another day. I'm supposed to be telling Henry's story, and Marshal has so far been hogging it. Anyway, it's 1219, and within a few days of the Marshal's funeral, Pandulf was interfering in every state of affair of the kingdom, even badgering the magnates on policies, and trying to appoint his own officials. And it wasn't just Pandulf, as the Cardinal was working closely with Peter de Roche, and before long, Hubert de Burgh. The Marshal's fears were already manifesting, and as the year went on, this new triumvirate began to crumble, bickering, squabbling, forming a wedge between the 3 powerful magnates. Henry, meanwhile, was still in his minority, but unless tragedy struck, his coming of age would be fast approaching. Naturally, there were talks as to when this should be. Traditionally, the age of 14 was preferred. The papacy certainly preferred this, as did continental Europe. It not only came with the accepted age of the boy's puberty, but with the end of formal education. 14 was the accepted date when a child's minority ended. But not in England. England it was 21, and the triumvirate that now controlled the kingdom were clinging to it. Pandulf did his best to influence affairs with France and Wales. It was in Henry's interest to have peace, because the 5-year truce agreed by King John and King Philip had come to an end. On the 10th of May, Pope Honorius asked King Philip if he wanted to extend the truce, and King Philip agreed. The truce was extended by 1 more year. It was a start, and Henry spent Christmas at Marlborough Castle with Peter de Roche. And the next year, 1220, in May, the truce was extended by another 4 years. But meanwhile, the Pope had another request. Now that Henry had secured his domain, there should be a second coronation, a proper one, in London with a crown. Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, would conduct this as lawfully dictated. The magnates were delighted and began planning. And on the 17th of May, 1220, not at Gloucester, but at Westminster Abbey, where all his Norman ancestors had been crowned, Henry III was crowned a second time by Stephen Langton. This coronation was more elaborate than his previous rushed affair, and was quite a harmonious event, and many prelates and barons attended. The government was now firmly established. Everyone important was there to see the coronation oath. This time, his mother's tiara wasn't present. Instead, a holy relic, at least in the eyes of Henry, was to be his crown, the diadem of St. Edward the Confessor, Henry's hero and patron saint of England. Yes, patron saint, as St. George hadn't yet got the job. And St. Edward's feast day was also around the same day as Henry's own birthday. So this opulent and harmonious ceremony was probably the best day of Henry's life. After this lavish ceremony, there was the obligatory feast at Westminster Hall, where around 4,000 chickens were roasted, plus gallons upon gallons of good wine and ale. You could just imagine the spectacle. Finally, Henry had a proper coronation, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he was king. But this is just the icing on the cake. The cherry in the decorations had come in the form of a foundation stone at Westminster Abbey. For the day before the coronation, Henry had laid this stone, beginning the construction of the new Lady Chapel that was to be built. And this wasn't just any chapel. This was a new style of architecture imported from France, the Gothic style. Henry had fallen in love with it. Though this isn't the same Lady Chapel you see today, no. Some utter pillock called Henry VII demolished Henry's one and built his own. Anyway, in other news, Guarda Bicchieri is in talks with Pope Honorius III regarding a petition to relocate the cathedral currently situated at Old Sarum. You see, arguments, even physical fights, had been breaking out between the clergy and the nobility at Old Sarum. Plus, problems with the wells had been already going on for several decades. There had already been petitions in the past to get the cathedral relocated, to no avail, and the cathedral there was exposed to bitter winds. There's lots going on here. Bluntly put, the cathedral was not fit for purpose, and an indulgence was needed for the Bishop of Durham, Richard Poore, to relocate this sacred building. The indulgence was granted by Pope Honorius III, and in 1220 a new location was found. Thus began the construction of Salisbury Cathedral, and the city of Salisbury erupts around it. Another point of interest. The architect was a master stonemason known as Elias of Dereham, also a member of the clergy, and to this day he is known mostly among Freemasons, as Elias has a lodge dedicated to him. Chapter 586, in fact. There you go. Back to Henry. You can understand why he's known as the Gothic King. He didn't introduce Gothic architecture to England. It's been around a little while. It's just rare. But it's a style of architecture that erupts during his reign, building after building, lady chapels, cathedral fronts, choirs. Unfortunately, though, his mother wasn't present for any of this. She had left the country in the summer of 1218, abandoning her children and rushing off to France in order to marry Hugh de Lusignan. A highly controversial affair, mainly because Hugh was set to marry her 8-year-old daughter Joan, a marriage that Hugh wasn't happy with at all, but it involved a contract with King John, which he couldn't get out of. So Isabella broke up the sham marriage and married Hugh instead, much to his relief. Right. Henry wasn't happy, no fan whatsoever of his new apparent French stepfather, and demanded his mother's dower, as well as Joan's, to no avail. Even Pope Honorius was not pleased with Isabella. He demands that she end the harassment of her son, the king. A truce was settled in the autumn, but a weak truce. Isabella wasn't budging an inch. Instead, she would start a new French family, washing her hands of the old one. And in June, Henry is in York, meeting with the Scottish king, Alexander II. He himself is only in his 20s, early 20s. The two came into an agreement. Remember Joan, Henry's sister? She'd marry Alexander and secure an alliance. Aside from all this, Henry is becoming increasingly present in all the council meetings. He spends his time accompanying his advisors as they reclaim castles that belong to him. A move that was mostly successful. William of Aumale required persuasion, but he understood the error of his ways. Some magnates tried to grant Henry his majority, but predictably this didn't get passed. Although Pope Honorius did get Pandulf to order all the bishops in possession of royal castles to hand them over to the king, while capping magnates to hold 2 castles at any one time. Bugger was, Langton preferred the castles in the hands of the English barons. Peter de Rocher wished the Poitevins to be included in this also. Most likely because Peter de Rocher wasn't English, he himself was from Poitou, and he's also trying to hold a few royal castles. Many nobles weren't from England. French was the language spoken by the nobility, and even the king probably only knew rudimentary English. Now we know he spoke it because in later years he had spent a lot of time with the peasantry. He was very charitable. These people wouldn't have spoken many words of French, so it can be assumed that Henry used English. And the loss of the continent was over a decade ago, and increasingly it seems that the old lands, once a part of the Angevin Empire, were being seen as a foreign land and not a part of the traditionally held lands of the English. Times were changing, indeed.